The King has spoken of the spirit of unity that has helped London get over the horrors of the July 7th bombings on the 20th anniversary of the worst ever terrorist attack on British soil. 52 people died when bombs were set off on tube trains and a bus. The Prime Minister says those who tried to divide us failed. Well, around 8:50 in the morning of July the 7th in 2005, bombs were detonated at Edgware Road, Russell Square and Aldgate underground stations, and a fourth device exploded an hour later on a bus on diversion through Tavistock Square. Now, victims and survivors have reflected on the atrocity with Sky's Lisa Holland.
Arriving in London for the anniversary of the 7/7 bombings, the family of David Fulks, who died at Edgware Road. David was from Oldham and in London meeting a work colleague. He was just 22 years old. 20 lost years. Can you talk to us about that?
As I said a few minutes ago, we're just an ordinary working class family from Oldham, but we should have a son. And he should have his family. And I shouldn't be having this conversation with you. I should be at home at this time having dinner or going to the pub with David. And it's not possible to describe the feeling of having your son murdered in such a pointless way.
Over the last 20 years, Graham Fulks has become a leading campaigner for the victims' families. He still believes there are unanswered questions about events leading up to the attacks and what was known about the bombers.
The public inquiry is the only way, because at a public inquiry, people can be compelled to come and give evidence. At an inquest, they can just say, no, I'm not coming, and that's what happened.
Others share that view, like Adrian Hiley, who survived the Edgware Road attack. In spite of his own injuries, the former combat medic was credited with saving the life of fellow passenger Danny Biddle.
Initially it was just dead quiet, and then a lot of people started screaming. It's a different type of scream, fear and pain. And Danny was bleeding a lot through his leg, and I had to sort of stem the blood flow to use my belt and my shirt as a tourniquet. I remember putting my hands into saying to Danny, this is going to hurt. And I put my hands into his leg to try and find his femoral artery or try to stem the blood while I put the tourniquet on.
In London's Hyde Park, steel pillars now stand in remembrance of those who died. To mark the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 attacks, survivors and bereaved families will gather for a special memorial service, remembering the 52 people who lost their lives and the more than 700 who were injured. In the 2 decades that have passed since those lives were taken, the Metropolitan Police say lessons have been learned, with a significant shift in its response to counter-terrorism.
The changes that brought policing and our security services, particularly MI5, much more close together, so that we now have the closest joint operating arrangements anywhere in the world. And secondly, counter-terrorism work became something that wasn't just about what was based in London, and a network was built with bases in all of the regions across the country.
20 years after 7/7, the government says Islamist and right-wing extremism continue to pose Britain's biggest threats. Lisa Holland, Sky News.
Well, the King's message marking the anniversary highlights what he says was the extraordinary courage and compassion in the face of the bombings, as well as the importance of standing against those who seek to divide. He says today, as we mark 20 years since the tragic events of 7th July 2005, my heartfelt thoughts and special prayers remain with all those whose lives were forever changed on that terrible summer's day. While the horrors will never be forgotten, we may take comfort from the way such events rally communities together in solidarity, solace and determination. It is this spirit of unity that has helped London and our nation to heal.
I'd like to say that our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is here with me now. Martin, great to see you. First question, take us back to 20 years ago. Had you ever, and still 20 years on, have you ever covered anything like this?
No, I mean, it was a real shock. But I suppose, in a way, we weren't surprised, because I remember being at a meeting of the Metropolitan Police Authority in the days after 9/11, when the then Commissioner, Sir John Stevens, told the committee, make no mistake, we're next. So I guess those of us, particularly those of us that work in this area, had anticipated some kind of attack, perhaps on the lines of 9/11. It took 4 years, but that's not to say that there wasn't a sense of terrible shock and confusion, certainly in those early hours.
That's really interesting. I want to come to that in a second, but it sort of speaks to a question I was going to ask later. 9/11 now is looked back on as quite a significant intelligence failure on the part of the American intelligence community. The fact that we were under such a severe threat as early as 2001 and that these didn't materialise till 2005, does that suggest the intelligence community did quite a good job in between? Or is 2005 still a big intelligence failure on the British part, or not?
Well, there was a lot going on before this bomb attack, and certainly a year before, MI5 had been given a huge boost to its funding, and there was a recognition that the intelligence services needed to, where they did become aware of people who posed a threat, put a bigger effort into keeping them, well, monitoring them if they could. But there was a report by the Intelligence and Security Committee, the UK's government committee, a year after 2005, which concluded that overall it couldn't have been avoided. There weren't great intelligence misses, but two of the bombers, Shehzad Tanweer and the leader, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, had come on the radar of MI5, but in a very peripheral way. They had been linked to another gang of bombers whose plot was interrupted in 2004. There was a gang largely from West Sussex and Surrey who were planning to explode a fertiliser bomb at the Blue Water Shopping Centre and at the Ministry of Sound nightclub. That was interrupted, but during that investigation, before it was interrupted, those two 7/7 bombers had been seen having some kind of contact with those bombers. But the conclusion of MI5 was that they didn't pose a threat, or none that they recognised at the time.
And so just take us back then to your recollections of the day as it unfolded, and I guess the scale of shock that was unfolding across the country, not just in London.
Well, it was a kind of slow burn to begin with, because I was on a train. I was late into work. Remember that 24 hours before, it had been announced that London was to host the 2012 Olympics. That was the only story in town, so a lot of us were late into work, I suppose, in that sense. I was on a train. The train stopped, Southern Rail, nobody was surprised at that, but a guard came through and said that there was a power surge on the tube network and the whole of the underground system was knocked out. And that immediately got me thinking that was unusual. I'd never heard of all the tube trains being suspended. And I made a call to Scotland Yard, and I guess I was thinking, what's the ultimate power surge? An explosion. And immediately somebody at Scotland Yard told me that this was serious, there were casualties, there were a number of incidents. Officially, there was a fire at Aldgate Station, but already I was being told that there was more than that. And within 2 hours, the Commissioner, Sir Ian Blair, had made it clear that this was a major terrorist attack.
Fascinating stuff, and hearing your recollections of how that unfolded. We've got more from you throughout the morning and throughout the day, and there's some commemorative events as well today.
There are two principal ones. In fact, there's already been a wreath laying, I think, or perhaps happening at, I think, at Hyde Park, the memorial there to the 7/7 survivors and those who died. Church service at St Paul's Cathedral, and another service in Hyde Park sometime this afternoon.
Martin, great stuff. Thanks so much. I'm delighted to say that we can now speak to Adam Wishart, a documentary maker and author of the book 3 Weeks in July, and Paul Dadge, a former firefighter who gave first aid to victims. This picture of him helping one of those victims whose face had been burnt badly is one of the images that stuck in people's minds 20 years ago. A very good morning to you both. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning.
Paul, if I can start with you, take us back to that moment, not even when you started helping people, but the moment when the attacks unfolded and you became aware of them.
Yeah, so we say aware of the attacks, but I wasn't aware of the attacks until I actually saw it on Sky News at 12:15 in the afternoon, the bomb where I was at 10 to 9 in the morning. But I'd come across what was happening at Edgware Road Tube Station and decided that I wanted to do what I could to help the people who were at that scene there.
And what kind of kicked in for you there? Your firefighters training? Was it your moral compass?
I've always said that I don't think it was that. It was the moral compass. It was just common sense that there was a group of people who'd clearly been involved in an incident, and people who weren't involved were starting to mill in with that group, and I wanted to make sure that they were looked after. And the picture that was taken was we'd been evacuated from the Marks and Spencer store where we'd been. So there was concern about a secondary device, and we ran across the road and were pictured running across that road.
And Adam, in terms of trying to retell the moment 20 years ago and to capture the emotion of it all, stories like Paul's are crucial, a tool in your filmmaking.
Yeah, we wanted to make a series about those incredible 3 weeks. And the story goes from Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, to Ian Blair, the Commissioner of Police, to those people on the ground, first responders like Paul, but also the survivors and the victims.
And explain to us a little bit more of some of that kind of moment that you captured in the film that you've obviously gone through with your book and the filmmaking, the shock and how the UK responded.
Well, I think it's difficult looking back because we understand them to be suicide bombers. But at the time, nobody knew what they were or what was going to happen. And the fear within the security services was that these were the explosions that were the first of a wave or a series of bombs that were going to come and devastate London in the weeks to come. And so for the police, it was a race against time to find out who had done this. You know, was it a suicide bomb or had they just left bags on the tube? And if there was a network, was the network armed and prepared and willing to do more attacks in the days to come? And so the police were working at breakneck speed to find out what was at the crime scenes, but also to look at all the CCTV to try and find out who did it and if another attack could be prevented.
Paul, you're obviously a former firefighter. Do you look back on how all of the emergency services responded in that moment with admiration? Were you impressed or...?
Yeah, I think the emergency services are kind of the forgotten heroes, if you like, from the day. A very traumatic day for those, especially the police recovery teams who had to work underground in ridiculous temperatures. And it's suffice to say that those emergency services are much more prepared now than they were in 2005. The ambulance service, for instance, they're called hazardous area response teams that are made up of paramedics who respond to deal with incidents with mass casualties, which we didn't have in 2005. So I do think that we're a lot better prepared. It was difficult being on the scene of something like that because I wasn't aware of what was happening outside of Edgware Road, and I remember thinking, where are all the emergency services? And it wasn't until I saw a picture of the bus and I thought that the bus roof had been ripped off, and I thought, never mind that, you want to be down here at Edgware Road, and then realised as the Sky ticker came across the screen saying explosions across London, that I realised the full extent of the...
So when you were first there on site, around lunchtime or whenever it was, were you aware there was a terrorist attack and a series of terrorist attacks?
So I arrived probably about 9:10 in the morning, so the bombs went off at 10 to 9. I was there about 9:10, and it was 12:15 in the afternoon before we realised it was a terrorist attack. Until that point, everybody who was coming out of the tube, they were talking about a power surge, and I had no reason to question that, but the smell from that day will always remain with me. I've never smelt it since. It was just like an acrid burning smell.
Adam, in terms of that fear that there could be many more attacks to come, in your filmmaking and politicians, police and security services that you spoke to, I mean, gauge for us how big a scale of that fear was. How did it compare, say, to the same sort of US fear following 9/11?
Well, it was pretty intense. I mean, Tony Blair tells a story that in the days after 7/7, he was given intelligence that there was an imminent threat of an attack, that a new bomb was going to go off. And he, as the Prime Minister, had to make a decision. Should you keep the London transport system open and prevent it, or should you close it down? And in the end, he made the judgment that the intelligence was unlikely to be correct, that it was just one of the kind of flim-flam of ideas that fly around at this point, and decided to keep London transport open. But he acknowledges in the book that, you know, had it gone wrong, he would have been the person to blame. And so there was a very real and serious fear that more was going to happen, and subsequently 2 weeks later there was another set of bombs, albeit they didn't go off because one of the lead bombers had failed his GCSE chemistry.
It's crazy to think about all of those sorts of details. In terms of the threat level and our ability to respond, have you done any kind of assessment or your thoughts towards that? I mean, I guess we're much more aware of these sorts of threats that exist today, but...
Well, these were the first homegrown suicide bombs on British soil, and so it was a kind of revelation and a new thing. And, you know, the book describes the process from 2001, from 9/11 until 2005. And during that period, the intelligence services were tracking and disrupting plots and being moderately successful, albeit the bombers of 7/7 were always just over the periphery. They could see them, but they weren't a priority. And so subsequent to 2005, there was a massive investment in the security services, and there were different methods to tackle these people. And to some extent, the security services have been successful, but the problem is, you know, you just need one lone wolf to come at you. And but there haven't been, you know, since 2006, there haven't been such sophisticated networks of people, often controlled or advised from abroad, because those networks have been disrupted.
Paul, final word in terms of 20 years on, the kind of lasting impact that all of this has had on you?
My life has been somewhat carved from what happened as a result of 7/7. I'm very much in touch with what happens in terrorism. I'm very much involved in politics now. I'm a bit of a troublemaker for the government. Emergency response units were canned in 2005 because they couldn't actually get through to the emergency because they didn't have blue lights. So one of the recommendations that came out was to have blue lights, but 19 years later, those blue lights have now been removed. So these are kind of things that I now look at and go, why are we doing these things? Well, these were recommendations. So I think I'll always be somebody that's a vocal critic when it needs to be made of lessons that haven't been learned.
Paul and Adam, thanks both for joining us. Much appreciated on this 20th anniversary of those 7/7 bombings. Here comes the Prime Minister and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, as the clock turns to 8:50. Of course, the time that the first bomb went off, those first bombs were detonated on London Underground trains near Aldgate, Edgware Road and Russell Square Station. A fourth device then did explode on a double-decker bus in Tavistock Square about an hour or so later, and this is all taking place at the memorial that was established already, of course, in Hyde Park. And there's a service at St Paul's later on today.
Remembering those 52 people that lost their lives 20 years ago.
We're going to continue to monitor this wreath laying and all of the events in the day ahead on this, the 20th anniversary of the 7th of July bombings. 8:50 was when they began 20 years ago today, and hence the timing of this initial part of today's commemorative events. The Prime Minister there and Sadiq Khan laying wreaths in central London.